We're doing a video interview of Thor Bussinger, and a veteran of the Navy and a UDT member. And here's Thor.
Okay, well, I'm Thor Bussinger. My wife and I found Anderson Island back in the early 90s. We had the cabin that I'm sitting in here built in 1992. We're basically weekenders, so I would say for the last 28 years we've been coming out here pretty regularly, just about every weekend in the summers and quite often in the wintertime. My naval career began in 1965. I had graduated from a junior college in electronic data processing, and at that time there was a war going on in the Southeast Asia in a place called Vietnam, which I could, at that time I'm sure I couldn't find on a map, but I can now. And so we got our draft notice. When I graduated from college, I decided that I wanted to be a Marine because growing up in the country, I was very used to hunting and fishing, and that's the way I thought I would best serve my country at wartime. A buddy talked me into joining the Navy. He thought it'd be great. We could chase women around the world in all these different seaports, and I thought that sounded pretty good. So we did that. 2 weeks into boot camp, I never saw him again for 3 years. Anyway, I digress. So 1965, I got on a train in Williston, North Dakota. My father took me down there, put me on a train, and went to San Diego, California, where I went through boot camp. During the course of boot camp, they asked me what I wanted to be, and I told them I wanted to be a U.S. Navy frogman. And they said, good luck with that. First you got to get a rating. So they selected electronics technician training, ET. So they sent me up to Treasure Island, which is an island between San Francisco, California and Oakland, where I went through electronics technician A school. When I got done with A school, which I think was like a 28-week course, they said, where would you like to go now? And I said, I'd like to be a Navy frogman. And they said, no, that's not going to happen. First you got to go to the fleet, and you got to serve for a year, and then maybe you can try it. So they sent me to probably the nicest, plushest place in the world, which was Imperial Beach, California, Ream Field Naval Air Station, where I worked as an electronics technician in the control tower, where all the helicopters were coming and going at that time, which was great because I got to do my normal electronics technician work in the control tower during the day, and I got to train for a UDT, which is what I wanted to do, in the evenings. And every 2 months I'd put in a new chit. I'd say, hey, I want to be a U.S. Navy frogman. And they would say, good luck with that. You're way too small. You'll never make it. You're not going to do it. Eventually, I had a chief petty officer who said, okay, we'll give you a shot. So 15 miles, they gave me a shot. I went up 15 miles up to Coronado, California, which is where the amphibious base is. And I had no trouble passing the requirements, which is running and swimming and sit-ups and push-ups. So I got selected to go into the underwater demolition team training, and I got a winter class. So I started at like January 3rd of 1966. And the demolition training has been well documented, but primarily it's lots of swimming, lots of cold water, lots of physical things. Plus you've got the weapons training, demolition training, dive training, orienteering training, so you can read a map. You can chart and do cartography work for clearing beaches, which is our primary task, but still to clear beaches for the Marines. I went through that training. I graduated, exactly, I can't remember when I graduated, but it was somewhere in 1966. So I graduated and I went across the street where the underwater demolition teams were, and I was assigned to underwater demolition team 12. And when we got across the street, they immediately measured us for our wetsuits, issued us K-bars, issued us a dive watch, and all our uniform stuff, and we went to work. In the teams, you're doing one of two things. You're either training to go to war or you're going to war. And I was lucky enough to spend my first 6 months in the team's training. So I went to Army parachute training in Fort Benning, Georgia. I went through SEER training, which is this survival, evasion, resistance, escape training, and several other jungle training. I spent like a month up in north of San Francisco training with the riverine patrol boats up there, where our job was to pretend we were Viet Cong and attack the people operating the river boats. Anyway, somewhere getting toward fall, our team was going to Vietnam. So I left a couple weeks early because I was in what they call the headquarters platoon, so I was in charge of electronics equipment. So I went to the Philippines, where my basic job was to make sure all the handheld sonar equipment worked. We had sonar equipment that was about the size of a large plate that we could aim underwater, and it would go ping, 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 bong, 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 as it was bouncing off metal, which we used to detect everything from downed helicopters to downed river boats to anchors to anything else they were trying to locate. Let's see, while in the Philippines, we practiced every day doing demolition, parachute jumping. We ended up jumping out of everything. So I had day jumps, night jumps, water jumps, helicopter jumps, fixed plane jumps, and every combination thereof. And then I went through jungle warfare training with the Filipino soldiers. And I went through second-class diver school in the Philippines, which is where we did, the hard hat diving and underwater cutting and welding and all the normal things a second-class diver is responsible for. And then I got called into my captain called me into the office and said, "Thor, I want you and another frogman to join up with a platoon and meet them in the Mekong Delta," which is great because now I was actually going to go in country. So we packed all our gear and we loaded it up a sea bag and we headed for Vietnam. So we flew over there on a C-130, flew in country. We arrived in Saigon, Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base. And that was my first real understanding, although we trained and went through all kinds of classes on what to expect. That airport was shot to hell. It was half the roofs of the buildings in the airport were gone. We sat in a structure that looked like it was in the middle of the war, which it was. Anyway, we got into the base, and one memory that comes to mind is there was a soldier there who was going home the next day. And he asked myself and the other frogman that was with me if we would protect him during the night. And he would pay us $40. So I sat on one side, he sat on the other side. Next morning we got up to go where we were going, he paid us $40 and we were off. It just sticks in my mind. Anyway, so we loaded onto a helicopter that was going down to the Mai To Dong Tam area. When we got in this helicopter and we both rode on each side of this helicopter, the doors were back on it. And we sat outside of that thing with our M16s in our laps looking out over the jungle as we flew down from Saigon to Dong Tam. And I didn't have a clue what was going on. The whole thing was mystical to me to see all this lush jungle down below. Anyway, we got down to Dong Tam, and as we were coming in to land in a helicopter, we came under fire. And I hadn't even been in Vietnam for a day at that point. And the helicopter pilot says, "Okay, we're under fire, get out." We got out and we grabbed our sea bag, jumped out, and he was gone. and we laid out in the middle of the field, I guess it's an airfield, and for like, I don't know, seemed like a long time, but it was probably 15 minutes before somebody walked out there and got us and told us where we were going to go. So he led us down to the river, and there was a small skiff down there, basically a small Boston whaler, and there were two of my superior enlisted men, a chief and a petty officer in the Boston whaler, and myself and my other frog friend got in that boat, and we headed out into the middle of the Mekong River, where we eventually got to a supply boat. And the supply boat was docked out in the middle, probably at least a quarter mile, if not closer to a half mile out in the river. And all of the underwater demolition team that I was, platoon that I was on, stayed on that supply boat for, well, I stayed here for 3 months. And so I had a barge on the side which had a locker on it with all our dive equipment, which consisted of all our tanks and wetsuits and weapons, etc. And then at night, or during the day too, all of the river boats would come up and tie up alongside where they would get fueled, and the sailors on the river boats would get fed, and etc. So in that time, and then we also, our job at that time was, I guess, threefold. We had something they called an aqua dart, which was like a skidoo. Very fun thing, but instead of sitting on top, you basically laid in the water, so the only thing exposed out of the water was your head and shoulders, and you cranked on the throttle and the handlebar like this. And on that aqua dart, they had cartography equipment, so you basically could chart the rivers. And then it also had a 270-degree camera on the mount, so you could snap pictures when you wanted to. And our job was to go down the small tributaries to the Mekong River and basically chart them so they could see how deep they were and were they big enough to handle river boats, etc., etc. That was one thing that we did continually. The other one was we would actually ride on the river boats. So when the river boats would go on an operation, they basically would have a lead boat which would have a flamethrower on the front of it. The second boat would have, well, basically two frogmen, or one. Sometimes it would be just myself, sometimes myself and another one, but never more than two of us. And we would sit on we'd take about 40 pounds of plastic explosives with us. And our job was to, number one, to supply fire support. And if they hit something in the water like nets, or there were bunkers on our side was to jump out and go blow it up, so they couldn't reuse the same dug out foxholes on the side, or they could unentangle the fish nets. And I guess I said there was three things. The other one, we would spend time swimming on our own U.S. boats. So it was a bigger boat coming up and down the river. We would go down and check the bottoms of boats for mines or any other thing that might have gotten attached to them. And we never did find any Vietnamese mines, so that was good. And then we would also swim on our own U.S. boats coming down to see if they could spot us. And to my knowledge, they never could. You know, we'd fly with drift water and just swim on them. So basically that was most of it. We kept that up for 3 months. We lost a few people. My captain came down there, Bob Condon, flew over there to see what the teams were doing and how they were operating, and he went out on one of the operations I just told you about, and he took an RPG through the bow of the boat, and it killed him. And the people who were operating down there at that time, we had about 30% casualties and 2 deaths that I can remember. So after 3 months in there, I'm not sure where the rest of that platoon went, but they flew me up to Da Nang. And I got up to Da Nang and operated with SEAL Team 1 people for a few weeks. And from there, another frogman, and I don't know where he came from, but the two of us ended up flying from Da Nang up to Cla Viet, South Vietnam. The Cla Viet River is about 4 miles south of the DMZ, demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. So we went up there and we were attached to 3 EOD naval personnel. EOD is Explosive Ordnance Disposal personnel. And the 5 of us were attached to a Marine battalion that operated out of that area. And during the 3 months I was up there, which by the way there was no, I don't remember ever having fresh food the entire time, so we ate sea rations for 3 months up there, which has got nothing to do with anything. But our main tasks up there were to work with the Marines. They would go on operations where they would search a village. We'd put our scuba tanks on one of the Amtraks and walk alongside the Amtraks until they would go in and sweep a village. And basically did the same thing the Marines were doing. Other times, if we or the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese soldiers or the Marines found caches of weapons, which they did daily, they would bring them back and we would load them on a truck and we would drive down the beach and put all of the U.S. dud munitions plus all of the North Vietnamese cache, stuff they found in the cache, and then we would load C4 on the pile and just blow it up. We spent a lot of time doing that, at least several times a week. And then we would spend time diving, looking for down rivercraft from the Cla Viet River or down helicopters. And our job was to go down and tie a balloon on it so they knew exactly where it was. We would take bags with us and load everything on the boats that they didn't want the Vietnamese or somebody to dive down and take off later. So any bodies or weapons we would bag up and send to the top. And I think that might, and I guess the interesting thing, it might be interesting to somebody, is the fact that at that time we lived in we called hooches, so they're basically small square made out of wood buildings completely surrounded by 2 rows of sandbags. And in the evenings we had a small, maybe a 6 foot by 6 foot cellar that was covered with 1/2 inch steel plates. So when incoming came in, we could dive down there and not get blown to bits. And which happened, we had incoming there I think just about every night for the entire 3 months I was there. And it got to the point where you could hear it before the first shot would hit, and you could be down in that hole and there'd be 6 of us crammed into a small little spot until such time as you get the all clear siren saying, we think it's over. Anyway, somewhere along that line, I said it was time to go home. So I flew back down to, I believe it was back down to Saigon at that time, and caught a flight back to the Philippines. And at the Philippines, my job was to take all the underwater demolition team 12 and pack it up into boxes. The rest of the team, of course, they got to go straight home. And then once that was done, that was the end of my tour. And that would have been sometime in, let's see, I was there in Vietnam sometime from early '67 to late '68. So I was there for the Tet Offensive of '68. And then after I got home, I spent another 6 months training to go back to war, which I did not do. I ended up getting out of the Navy. And that was my naval career. So I made a lot of good friends, had a great time.
How did a guy from North Dakota decide to be a frogman? What prompted you to go into that area?
Well, let's see, I'm not exactly sure what prompted it, but we grew up where I grew up, we all hunted, so we all did the normal bird hunting, and so we lived on a farm, so there weren't that many neighbors, so we could walk a mile and have the greatest pheasant hunting and quail hunting and deer hunting and etc. So we grew up with weapons. My dad, we didn't have any lakes very close to where I was. My dad taught me how to swim in a small dam, which is where the cows got their water. And so my brothers and I, we would go down there and swim in the little muddy river or swim in the dams, and every time we got out, we'd have to search each other's bodies to pick off the leeches and the ticks. And we liked water. We did. So anyway, I think there was also a movie out about that time about the frogmen and what they had done in World War II, and I was impressed by that. Decided that was my calling.
And were there any really big memorable events that happened while you were there that really stick to, or what did you learn? What was the major thing you took away from this service in the UDT?
I think everyone should serve, and I still go back and the same people I served with, although we did a lot of things in 1s and 2s and small platoons, we share that time and memory, and that's a good thing. Good friends. Let's see, what do I bring back? I could think of. I think I mentioned that I went back to the Philippines for a short period of time, and after I got out of Vietnam, and we were sitting in a bar in the Subic Bay, and there was 4 of us, and we all said, you know what, that was not so bad. Let's re-up and do it again. We were all gung-ho at that time, and we all high-fived each other and said, yeah, let's go do it. 2 of us did, and 2 of us didn't, and I was one of the ones that did not. Anyway, other takeaways out of that time is there's so many. I got to train for an Apollo landing when I got back to the States after being in Vietnam. I didn't get to go on an Apollo recovery. I would have had to re-up to do that. That was part of their enticement to get me to re-up. And it was tempting, but I didn't do it. I don't...
And what were your parents in support of you going there as a frogman, or?
Well, that's a memory. My parents supported me in everything I did. Obviously, my mom cried a lot, and my dad kept his hidden. But I do recall going through training. I was telling him what the training was like and what I was going through with the underwater demolition training. He said, son, he said, they're training you. You have to be careful because they're going to expect you to use that knowledge once they've trained you for that. So my father was a wise man. But yes, they supported me in everything that I've done. I'd like to think they were very proud of my very small contribution. And I was going to say, along that same line is being here on Anderson Island, and I'm a member of the Legion here. I have met some terrific people with some really good military careers, and I'd be proud to serve with every one of them that I've met out here. I'm just blown away by some of the careers and the contributions they've made. And the SEAL teams. And back in the 60s, the underwater demolition teams were only supposed to operate up to the berm, which is the high level where seaweed and logs collect and the water doesn't go any higher. And they wanted to continue and expand the scope of what the divers and things were doing, so they formed a SEAL teams, which are designed to not stop the berm line, but to go in further to do reconnaissance, demolition work, capture high-value people for interrogation, and set up ambushes and do sniping to take out certain bad characters. And then I think there was a question about, submarine, other differences, and there weren't that terribly many other than the continued extensive training that the SEALs got past UDT teams. Both were qualified. We did a lot of submarine training. A lot of our underwater demolition team platoons would operate off submarines. So we had, at that time, they had two-man submarines that would carry people they could exit off a submarine. We would tie the SDV, which is submersible dive vehicle, on the top of the submarine. We would lock out of the submarine, go up on top with tanks, get into the SDV vehicle, and then we could go into a spot and drop off or pick up personnel. So we did a lot of lockout, lock-in training and operations at that time. And I think that was the only two questions.